Okay, sorry, I had to move the workstation back inside due to a torrential downpour. No biggie. So, um, this second part of today's lesson is continuing with the height determination. As I left off at, you measure the 2 points, the two tips of your fingers should give you a reasonable determinant of your entire stature. So, this becomes quite valuable when you find again the only body of evidence to work with to identify the person to whom the skeleton belonged if you have a single long bone. And if you look at your height determination slide, I have listed for you the femur, the tibia, and the fibula. And these are three leg bones. And the longest of your long bones is your femur, your upper leg bone from the knee to the hip. And that is the longest long bone there is. Crazy that even dinosaurs have the same anatomy. They have a femur and a tibia and a fibula. Dinosaurs, apes, iguanas, people, chickens. Crazy how all of these shared genes, I mean, there's the same gene that controls the development of these skeletal attributes. It's kind of neat how there's an interrelatedness among organisms that have been extinct for 65 plus million years and that we eat for lunch and dinner and we walk around with in our meat wagon, so to speak. Anywho, so looking at the femur, if a femur is the only body of evidence, you can take the measurement of that femur in centimeters. If you multiply the length of the femur in centimeters by 2.38 and then add an additional 61.4 centimeters to that quantity, you'll get the overall height of the person. Just like fingertip to fingertip gives you the overall height. The multiplication and then addition of those factors on the femur length in centimeters gives you overall height of the person. Now, the tibia and fibula are oftentimes mixed up by people first learning anatomy. The tibia is your lower leg bone that bears weight. That's your shin bone. One of my least favorite bones of the body. There's a few that are just really on the bottom of my list, and shin is one of them. It's gross. But the tibia is your heavier of the two, and it's what supports your body weight while standing. The tibia, if you take that length in centimeters, multiply that by 2.52, add an additional 78.6 centimeters to that, presto, you've got the height of that person just off the tibia. So that's, a valuable bone. The third one listed, it's not the only three, but these are the most accurate to use. The fibula is the outer, thinner lower leg bone. It's if you feel down the side of your leg just below your knee, there's that little bump that sticks out. That's the top of your fibula. The fibula is used for muscle connection, for articulation, the movement of your foot. It makes up the outer bump of your ankle. Everybody's got that outer bump of the ankle. That's the other end of your fibula. And we'll talk about breaks in that too later down the road. Super gross. But that allows for articulation, the movement of your foot, locomotion, all of that business that most regular people do. So you take that length in centimeters, multiply it by 2.68, and then add another 71.7, 71.8 centimeters to that, and presto, again, you have got the height of that person. So femur, tibia, and fibula, in that order, in terms of accuracy, will determine the overall height of the person based strictly on partial skeletal remains. That's pretty cool. So height determination is actually a mathematic equation. Pretty simple math, though. All right, if you click to your next slide, there is facial reconstruction. And this is oftentimes, really overblown in the programs like CSI and stuff. But it is one of those really cool harmonies between science and art. I know a lot of my students that take this class are not going into hard sciences, so to speak, in their career. But many of you are very artistic, and there are some outlets to make your artistic talents lucrative working in a forensic field. It's kind of cool. There are attributes of the skull, the craniofacial bones specifically, where you have universal depths of tissue. All right? And you can feel on your face, your cheeks, you can push in farther before you hit your zygomatic process, your cheekbone, farther than the tip of your forehead. There's very little amount of tissue between the actual frontal bone and the outside world than there is compared to your zygomatic process and the outside world. Different than your chin, different than your upper lip. So there are about 60 different places on your face and frontal bone that are universally similar enough person to person to where the underlying structure of the bone will affect the outward appearance of the person. So where the major differences lie is in the bone, not necessarily in the skin or underlying tissue. It's kind of cool. So you can, or an artist, a trained artist in the facial reconstruction, can put these little markers, they look like pencil erasers, that are stuck all over the actual skull found as evidence. Put these markers all over, and then fill in all of that space with modeling clay up to the levels, to the tops of each one of those little stickum markers, and smooth it out and get a reasonable representation of what that person kind of looked like. And some of the accuracy of it is surprisingly dead on. And the use of understanding whether you're reconstructing a Africoid face or a Mongoloid face, as we know there are features that differ among race. Accurately depicting that based on understanding the width of the nasal opening or the shape of the orbit, the eye sockets, or the arch in the jaw I discussed earlier, give that artist an idea of the race, or the likely race, or racial lineage at least, of that person. Pretty neat. Now, some difficulties arise in some of the really important attributes that makes each person unique in the exact cartilaginous structure of the nose, lips, whether they're fuller lips or really hair lips. There's no underlying bone structure that can really help determine precisely what that is. The thickness of your eyelids vary. You got two caucasoids, a caucasoid such as myself, and then say a caucasoid like Bernie Sanders, for example. We have very different facial features that are all soft tissue that kind of can't, we can't really guess accurately as to whether this caucasoid Miller or that caucasoid Bernie Sanders are going to have, we can put his features to fit on my face, and I'd be a whole different looking person. So difficulties arise basically in all of the ingredients that go into a hot dog. The lips, the nose, the eyelids, the ears. None of those are universally categorized. So although we can get most of the facial structure right, some of the real important parts like the lips, nose, eyelids, ears, hot dog ingredients, read the package, they're difficult to nail down. Now, there's a new technology that I have not included in the PowerPoint. I should probably update it. There's a new technology that incorporates DNA sequencing. So if they can extract some DNA from the bone tissue, from if there's any existing marrow or even inside the pulp of the tooth, extract DNA, run a profile on that. There are characteristics, as we know each characteristic is triggered by a gene or a group of genes. When we can analyze genetically that person and we have a skull, a much greater accuracy can be achieved because we know some of the historical linear attributes that person would have based on their genes. And there's even a computer system that can recreate what a person looks like, even down to eye color, based on the gene sequence, because we know which genes control which traits. And that's new. I mean, that's something within the last 5 years, and there have been several cases that an incredibly accurate composite was made by a DNA profile. That's pretty neat. So that should be in our facial reconstruction idea also. But on your third bullet, the photographic superimposition, that one's super easy. And they did this, I think, with Heinrich Himmler, one of the real super bad Nazis. Not that any of the Nazis were not super bad, but this guy's, one of the more famous, terrible ones. I believe his skull, or suspected his skull, was found in like Bolivia. And taking a picture of his skull and a picture of his face, put on a transparency, overlaid his face with the skull. His facial features fit perfectly on the skull features that were found and were suspected to have been his. Turns out it was his. And so photographic superimposition can be used at the very least to rule out. You've got a picture of your suspected missing person and the skull. You overlay the two. You can see if stuff's going to line up or if stuff's not going to line up. And if stuff doesn't line up, it's like, all right, likelihood this skull is not so-and-so. But if it does line up, that's another layer of certainty for identification purposes. That's pretty cool. So a layover transparent, super cheap, almost no technology required, and reasonably effective in ruling in or ruling out. A lot of our stuff in forensics, ruling out is just as important as ruling in. Well, it definitely wasn't that dude. We can go in a different direction, right? So that's pretty cool. So facial reconstruction helps. I do have an episode of CSI New York for you, and if I can find it somehow digitally to link it in, I could see that being one of our day's assignments. That deals with the full skeletal analysis. It's a really good one to sort of make it entertaining. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, autopsy. And I know we've mentioned autopsy early in our course. Autopsy does fit into the anthropologic realm, because you're looking at the body as evidence. And primarily in anthropology, it's skeletal remains, but autopsies are worth describing in detail here because there are autopsies that can be done on skeletal remains. But generally speaking, there's not a whole lot I need to add to this slide that is labeled autopsy. Not a whole lot. There's 3 bullets. The careful examination of the external and internal aspects of the body after death. General definition of autopsy. And there are 2 people that can conduct autopsies. Legal autopsies are carried out by either a coroner or a medical examiner. And that depends on the region, oftentimes on the county or state, whether you have a coroner or a medical examiner. Medical examiner is a licensed physician. They have gone to medical school. That is a requirement for being a medical examiner. A coroner, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily have to have a medical degree. A coroner is an elected official, and in many cases they do have a medical degree, but by law it's not required for them to. And the difficulties we run into with a coroner county as opposed to a medical examiner county is the possibility of bias due to re-election pressures. If, maybe a high-profile case comes across the coroner's desk and, the family of the deceased doesn't want certain aspects of that cause of death, say, was an overdose. We don't want to make it look like our family has a drug addict in it. Money's involved. There's all sorts of corruption, unfortunately, we see seeps into politics. So, with a coroner county, there is that consideration in maybe being either on purpose biased or maybe even subconsciously biased in terms of outcomes, cause of death, manner of death, those kinds of decisions for legal paperwork. In a medical examiner county, you don't have that layer of uncertainty or layer of potential dishonesty. So that's the difference between an ME and a coroner. Coroner is based on the word crown from kings. By order of the king, the coroner, coronation, crown. Anyway, side note, worthless. All right, moving on from the specifics of the autopsy and who can carry it out. There are cases where a mandatory autopsy. Hi, Kevin. Where a mandatory autopsy, you want to come up, is required. Not all deaths are autopsied. In fact, most are not. But there are some cases that it is by law a autopsy has to be conducted. So I have listed 8 of them, and some of them are pretty obvious in their reasoning, and some of them are not. An unidentifiable body, burned or decomposed, that's where it falls into an anthropologist's realm. We want to be able to identify A, who that person was, B, how they died, when they died. All of that business goes into the requirements for some level of autopsy examination. So an unidentifiable body, somebody that has decomposed to just bones or are beyond recognition. So that's a mandatory autopsy. Drug overdoses are mandatory autopsies. If someone is suspected to have had a drug overdose, their autopsy will determine if indeed it was the drug overdose that caused the death. It's an accidental death in most cases. So all drug overdoses it's a mandatory, it's state mandated that a autopsy is run. In prison, everyone in prison that dies is a mandatory autopsy case because the prisoner is unfortunately, a burden of the state, and for culpability issues, it is required that the cause of death is determined officially by anyone who is a ward of the state. The exception is that of a chronically ill inmate, someone that has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They're most likely going to die, and when they do, it's no surprise they died of complications of their chronic illness, and we don't need an autopsy. That's what they died from. So prisons, with the exception of late stage, chronic illnesses that would lead to death. Hit and runs, an accident, car accident where there is no person at fault because they left the scene. We need to determine whether that person died from that hit and run accident. Then that would lead to culpability or the commission of a crime. If that person had a stroke at the wheel and ran off the road, nobody is to blame, but an autopsy would be able to determine how that person expired when there was no other car involved. Airplane crashes, and this is strictly for insurance purposes. One of the terrible thing about airlines, you put on your seatbelt so you're safe. When you're traveling in an airplane at 500 miles per hour and the plane is coming out of the sky in what a pilot would refer to as an uncontrolled landing, you crash at 500 miles an hour. The seatbelt is not going to save you. The seatbelt is going to keep your torso attached to the chair that has a seat number on it. So you are more easily identified by your seat number because you are certainly expired, but at least you're connected to your chair for easy people sorting purposes. And it has to be determined medico-legally that the airplane crash was your cause of death if the family is going to have any say financial compensation. If the person died prior to the crash, say heart attack from terror, the airplane crash wasn't their exact, say, cause of death. Suspicious suicides, that one pretty much speaks for itself. If someone is apparently deceased as a result of their own doing, there's no crime. But if there is suspicion that this suicide was carried out by someone else and it's a homicide, now we're looking at the possibility of a commission, a criminal act. So suspicious suicides are autopsied, and that's we can get into greater detail on that at some point, but no need right now. I want to hit the last two so that we can be done with today's 2-video lesson. The last two are unattended deaths and unexpected deaths. An unattended death means the person had not seen a doctor in the past year. It doesn't mean they died alone necessarily. Old people sometimes die alone. Sad, but family hadn't visited in a week and person passed away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were unattended. The unattended means attending physician. If an old person dies, or a person with a disease dies from that, or dies of old age, and hadn't seen a doctor within that year, it is required by law that they are autopsied to determine the cause of death. If they had seen a doctor, and the doctor has, copious notes, this person is on their way out, and they finally go out, there's no need to autopsy it, at least as far as the state is concerned. The family may request an autopsy, but in most cases, they don't. So it's not a mandatory autopsy. And the last one, the unexpected death. Old people die. Sick people die. My medical examiner friend, he said, old people die. Well, I just saw her last week and she was fine. Well, people's definition of fine and actually being fine are oftentimes on two very different ends of a spectrum. She was fine. Well, she had diabetes. She was 150 pounds overweight. She had COPD. She was on oxygen, barely getting around, and had a terrible diet. And she died. Just because you saw her yesterday at the store doesn't mean she was fine. She was dying. So, sick people die. So that's not unexpected. Old people die. Grandpa. My grandpa was fine, and then he died. He was fine by my definition, but he was also old, and he died. Old people die. But a 16-year-old, playing basketball on the school team, feels faint, sits down, passes out, goes to the hospital, dies. That's unexpected. A relatively healthy young person just falling out and dying. That's a mandatory autopsy. A good family friend of ours had a son who literally woke up dead. He was in high school, went to bed at night, did not get up for breakfast. Mom went in and checked on him. He had left this world. Didn't kill himself, didn't have a drug problem, just died. Totally unexpected. That's an autopsy. That's a mandatory autopsy. So, unexpected deaths, absolutely mandatory autopsy. And I'd be surprised even if a family member wouldn't request an autopsy in a case like that. But all unexpected deaths are absolute mandatory. The next slide will, why cut incision is the one you see on all the shows, and I'll speak of it briefly in our next meeting. This is good for now. I hope it uploads and you're still paying attention. All right, enjoy. We'll talk again.